2 years, $10 million. Those were the stipulations under which Kerbal Space Program 2 should have been developed. 7 years and dozens of $1 million later, we still don't have a finished product. This is the story of how a beloved franchise was done dirty. Sit down, because this story needs to be told in detail, and strap yourselves in, because it's going to be wild. Hello everybody, and welcome. A lot can be said about Kerbal Space Program 2, and there are many different opinions on it from a gameplay and quality standpoint. But there is one thing everyone can agree on: the surprisingly tight secrecy around the game's development. Its announcement in 2019 came out of nowhere, and ever since there was a wall of secrecy between the fans of the original and the people developing it. Sure, there were a couple of well-polished so-called feature episodes to keep interest high, but actual gameplay? Actual mechanics that govern the game world? Those were barely known until the game was released into early access in February 2023. To mixed to negative reception. Today we're going to pull back the veil. I was able to reconstruct a timeline of events starting from 2017 when KSP2 started pre-production. In this video you're going to learn how the development of Kerbal Space Program 2 was ill-fated from the get-go. You will hear about diverging visions, bad decision-making, a mad scramble to get the game out of the door, and how it came to be that performance was as bad as it was on day one. Throughout of this, I'm going to stick to the facts how they were presented to me. I also spoke to KSP veterans Scott Manley, Matt Lown, and modding legend Linux Guru Gamer about the entire situation. And at the end, I'm going to share my own opinion on everything, and I hope we can engage in a conversation about how to proceed from here. I won't be able to fit everything into this, so there is more to come. For instance, I'm going to have a more detailed look at KSP2 multiplayer, because that deserves its own video. Hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you won't miss that once it's out. Patreon supporters and YouTube members will get early access to that as with every video, so check that out if you're interested. Alright, let's get into the real meat and potatoes. The information you're going to hear now was collected over many hour-long conversations that I had with multiple people deeply involved with the project across its lifespan. Due to legal reasons and fear of retaliation, I will not quote anyone directly and have to keep some things deliberately vague. But I'm not the only one that did some digging.
I don't think I've spoken to as many people as you have, but from the people I have spoken to, they've pretty much corroborated what you've put in your script that I've read.
But let me make something very clear. This is not a hit piece. If you are in the KSP2 sucks, screw the developers camp, you will not get validation from this video. I still want Kerbal Space Program 2 to be a success one day. But I do believe that all this secrecy was a detriment to the project, and I want to rip that away so everyone can see what went wrong at what point, but also so that we can hold the people in charge accountable and get them to make better decisions further down the line. Failing and learning is the Kerbal way after all. Like reverting to launch, let's start at the beginning. Pre-production. In 2017, Take-Two started shopping for a studio to develop the sequel to Kerbal Space Program 2. The contract landed with Uber Entertainment, who would later rename to Star Theory, founded by Bob Berry and Jonathan Maver. The original mission briefing was pretty simple. Your time frame is 2 years. Your budget is $10 million. At the time, studio manager Jeremy Abel supposedly said, "I like my chances," when he was given this task. His reasoning and that of the owners was that they would just do a revision of the existing game. Basically, they wanted to take the original code, polish it up, add new graphics and content, and sell it as a new version.
It's very obvious that there's a lot of KSP1 code in KSP2.
However, creative director Nate Simpson had a much broader vision. As a longtime fan of the original game, he wanted to do a reimagining instead of just updating it to modern standards and adding some stuff to it.
And then he asked, like, do you have any ideas for what you would want to do with it? And it just started pouring out of me like a fire hose. Like, we gotta have interstellar, we gotta have colonies. You know, it was just like everything I wanted to do.
And it appears he was able to convince Take-Two to share his vision. However, the timeline and budget constraints were wholly insufficient for the studio to pull off such a reimagining. This was the first problem and kept cascading through everything that went wrong from there on out, leading one of my sources to this conclusion: in some ways, KSP2 was doomed from the start. The second problem was the complete secrecy that the project was shrouded in. At the time, the studio only had principal engineer Chuck Noble. Not only was he already an experienced software engineer at the time, but he also has a degree in aerospace, aeronautical and astronautical engineering. Someone you would want on a project like this. If your goal was to make things realistic. More on that later. But aside from Noble, there were no engineers on the project yet. Due to the top-secret nature, the team was not allowed to use recruiters, but had to do the entire hiring process of new members in addition to their normal duties. During recruiting, they were not able to tell people what game or even what type of game they were hiring for. Again, because of the secrecy.
You're developing a game about space frogs. You know, it doesn't need to be treated like an ICBM being developed or something.
And due to the budget constraints, they were only able to hire junior engineers. Some were fresh out of college, some had no formal education at all. Almost none of them had significant experience, and only one of them had played Kerbal Space Program before. All of this would not have been too much of a problem if development had gone the less ambitious content revision route. During pre-production, the few team members did due diligence on the engine for the game. Aside from Unity, Unreal Engine was also considered to base KSP2 on. But since back then the plan was just to polish up KSP1, Uber Entertainment's owners intervened and ordered the developers to stick to the original code. No engine switch allowed. During my investigation, I have seen prototypes of KSP2 that were clearly done with KSP1's user interface and with KSP1's graphics. This would of course change because we're entering the next phase: early production. The vision for the game grew larger. Colonies, Interstellar and multiplayer became set in stone as must-deliver features. Yet at the same time, the delivery deadline of spring 2020 was also communicated as non-negotiable to the development team. This caused a lot of stress within the team and contributed to a couple of wrong decisions that were made in haste. One of which turned out to be a mistake that cost them a lot of time after all. And that was the decision to try to cram all the features into KSP1's code as ordered by management. Multiplayer turned out to be especially incompatible with the technology that they had to work with. In addition to that, the code was delivered to the development team with nobody to guide them through it. Contact to the developers at Squad was prohibited.
I'm still flabbergasted. So they got a dump of the KSP1 codebase, but they didn't have anybody who knew anything about it.
No. One of the reasons was back then the developers at Squad were working on the first expansion for the game, the Making History DLC, which came out in March 2018, well after the KSP2 team had already started working. The engineers for KSP2 had to work in the dark and figure out everything by themselves with no guidance from the experienced KSP developers, despite having loved to talk to them.
I can understand Take-Two wanting to enforce some secrecy prior to the 2019 announcement, but also that year was the year that Breaking Ground, the DLC for KSP1, came out. That came out in May 2019, so it would be a bit silly for Kerbal 2 to be like a known project at that point, because then who's going to buy that DLC with the knowledge that the sequel is going to be out the following year?
Without approval from above, nobody dared contact the developers at Squad directly. The engineers feared for their jobs if they did, a fear that would be proven right later after the game was announced. A developer answered a community question regarding a feature in KSP2 and was let go as a result. The reasoning? Communication to the public was not Star Theory's decision, but the publishers, and the single act of answering a community question regarding a feature that was already built into the game was treated as an unlawful disclosure. In the end, the people I spoke with said it cost them a year of development trying to stick to the original code instead of rewriting it.
If I was a code developer, like coming in and saying, okay, I'm going to build a sequel to Kerbal Space Program, as this guy that writes software, I understand the original game is absolutely full of technical debt. It breaks in all sorts of weird ways. So there is a philosophical, need to say, let's fix this. Let's rebuild this from scratch properly. But you have to do that with the understanding of why some of those decisions were made, why you do things in that way, and then maybe clean up the structure overall.
Despite their best efforts, the team arrived at the point where they had to refactor the code significantly so it could accommodate all the new elements that the reimagining demanded of Kerbal Space Program 2. This decision did not go down well with management, who understood little of the reasons behind it. Still, during regular milestone meetings, Take-Two gave the studio pass after pass, despite people familiar with these meetings believing that they should not have passed them. This was probably because Take-Two thought they sat on a potential gold mine. Management believed that they had a cultural successor to Minecraft on their hands. Basically, they wanted Kerbals as their version of Minions and had imagined an entire universe around them, including cooperation with a toy manufacturer.
When I first found Kerbal Space Program, right, it was on a Something Awful thread, and the title was, "This Could Be the Next Minecraft." And that's what actually made me interested. And it was only like, I played it for a bit, and then I realized that nobody else was making videos, and that I actually had a fair, understanding. But the parallel to Minecraft, I completely understand.
In a balancing act trying to satisfy both Take-Two's ambition as well as the existing community, Nate Simpson wanted to capture an audience adjacent to KSP to expand the player base and make things more accessible, yet keeping to the core mechanics. Management's perspective on the project exacerbated the secrecy around the project, because one of the reasons everything was kept under wraps so tightly was to keep people familiar with KSP1 as far from the sequel as possible. Management explicitly named veteran player Scott Manley as a person they did not want to have any input from.
This stays away from Scott. This is not for input from Scott.
I'm not offended that they chose not to ask me from a philosophical point of view.
Another reason for staying silent for so long was that Uber Entertainment had gotten a bad reputation for previous games, which I will not go into in this video. And Take-Two's management reasoned that keeping the studio a secret until it was too late would spare them conflict with the community. So, without any outside input, there was basically just one person making all the gameplay decisions: creative director Nate Simpson. While he had designed his first game at the age of 13, as he told me during one of our meetings, he is not an engineer by trade, but has a bachelor's degree in arts. Everyone I talked to describes him as a very visual person. He himself designed the Kraken Tree Duna monument, for instance. To him, it matters a lot how things look within the game.
I really like when you build an interstellar class vehicle at an orbital facility. I like the pageantry of leaving the parking spot. To me, that's a very majestic, beautiful moment. We're going to get a lot of cool cinematic stuff that comes out of that.
I've been surprised by how much prettier everything looks.
From what I've heard from everyone I spoke with, this focus on visuals sometimes resulted in more fundamental design and gameplay decisions to take the back seat. The people I talked to were also in agreement that Nate tended to micromanage single elements of the game during the time they were involved with the project. One of these decisions was wobbly rockets. Very early in development, even before the refactoring, it was discovered that the inherited KSP1 code could have made it possible to significantly reduce wobble and still keep the option to have joints break due to too much stress. If you look at footage released together with the game's announcement in 2019, you can see the same rocket flying very rigidly, and in another instance, very wobbly. Nate was convinced that the difficulty introduced by the wobble and joints breaking would be necessary to have a fun game.
I don't care what Nate says. I mean, I met the guy, he's a nice guy, but nobody likes wobbly rockets. And that is a direct result of using the KSP1 code.
That was the thing I really wanted them to fix in KSP2. when I launched my very first rocket at the ESA event. I watched it, and I watched it flex, and I was like, oh, well, there go my dreams. Like,
if we do a reality check, SpaceX managed to fly a 120-meter tall rocket welded together by steel rings, and it didn't wobble, not even when it was cartwheeling out of control during its first flight test.
Did it just do a Kerbal?
But there is an argument to be made for a limited amount of wobbliness.
It definitely teaches people, structural engineering, how to reinforce things, etc. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff over there. But to say that it has to have it in all stages was just ridiculous.
Something has become clear during my investigation. Nate Simpson is probably one of the biggest fans of Kerbal Space Program and really wants to deliver a fun product that appeals to a wider audience. None of my sources had bad things to say about him. However, they did not always agree with his decisions. Because he was not familiar with aerospace engineering, he sometimes steered KSP2 away from how things would work in real life. Maybe some of these decisions made the game more accessible for new players, but it also reduced the game's capability to serve as a teaching tool for people wanting to go into rocket engineering or spaceflight. This is what I alluded to earlier when I hinted at that keeping things realistic was not a priority.
Kerbal lets you do something and then learn something as a consequence. And so it very quickly let people develop skills which they could then see translated to, actual academic work.
After all this time in secrecy, in August 2019, Kerbal Space Program 2 was finally announced to the public to a very warm reception. The hype train was leaving the station and picking up steam. And yes, they finally let people like Scott Manley and myself in on the project, even flew us out to Seattle to get to know the developers during PAX West. I remember well how Scott had only one request addressing the developers.
I'm still going to say, don't screw it up. And in the nicest possible way, don't screw this up.
However, things would soon take a turn for the worse. Hostile takeover. Already before the event in Seattle, the studio had increased their engineering staff, finally including a couple of senior people. But the refactoring of the game's code was only about halfway done. It was already clear that the game would not be able to ship until spring 2020. Yet, management still communicated to the team that the deadline and key features like interstellar, colonies and multiplayer were non-negotiable. Shortly after PAX West, principal engineer Chuck Noble, who had been part of development since the start and knew the most about the game's code, left the project. Studio owners Jonathan Maver and Bob Berry began negotiations with Take-Two to sell the studio to the corporation. That deal was well on the way by the end of 2019, when greed derailed the entire thing. From what I was told, Maver and Berry wanted to increase the price significantly, betting on Take-Two willing to cash them out and making them multimillionaires before having to find another studio to work on KSP2. But Take-Two was not in the mood for these types of games. They basically said, nope. We don't need you, and pulled the intellectual property from Star Theory as a result, offering everyone on the team to transition over to continue working on the project. And here we return to an earlier mistake. Remember when I told you that during recruiting the engineers had no idea which game they would be working on during the hiring process? This resulted in almost everyone on the team not knowing the original game, and they also didn't start playing it after being hired. Therefore, they didn't have any emotional attachment to Kerbal Space Program at all. When the offer from Take-Two came in, many of the senior people tried to get better deals, better compensation for the work, but Take-Two didn't budge, and so only 4 engineers went over to work on KSP2 under the studio that would be later known as Intercept Games. Overall, it was about 20 people, but aside from those 4 engineers, the team consisted of artists and production people, and those 4 engineers were mostly junior people at the time from what I was told. It is now early 2020, and the game is nowhere near finished, and there is just a skeleton crew of inexperienced engineers. To improve this situation, technical director Paul Furio was hired with the mission of building up the team and setting processes in place to enable it to succeed. Thus began the next era for KSP2's development, the bumpy road to early access. With the new studio, a fresh start was possible. However, another old mistake crept back in. Top management gave the team a stipulation, and that was to keep the old, kind of broken Star Theory code and work with it instead of starting from scratch. Apparently, the word refactoring had started to cause unease in the upper echelons of Take-Two decision-makers, and to smooth those waves, the team was forced to keep improving the old code instead of starting with a clean slate. If you would have taken over that project, would you have kept that code or said, no, let's start fresh with the parameters we have developed based on design?
Both, okay? And let me explain that. I would not have wanted the entire code base. It had problems, as we all know. However, they did solve certain things, such as all of the calculations, all of the orbital mechanics, all of that stuff. That doesn't change. The gameplay stuff sucked. The mechanics actually works reasonably well.
Everyone I spoke to agrees that how they went about it was the wrong move. This was the second opportunity to really make a fresh start, and again it was wasted, forcing developers to work around something they in part knew little about, instead of building the game from the ground up and optimizing it for multiplayer from the get-go.
You don't put multiplayer into a code base like that. It has to be designed in.
I mention multiplayer because KSP2 multiplayer was something the game was sold on from the start. Nate Simpson even claimed in his first interview with me,
as we've been testing it internally, I have never heard people laugh so hard.
There is just one problem with this statement. Back when he said this in September 2019, he referred to an event where the team was playing KSP1 with mods. And yes, they did indeed have a lot of fun from how the story was told to me. Still, there was some rudimentary multiplayer in KSP2 back in the Star Theory days, but it was completely unstable and not really playable. Now at the new studio, multiplayer was rarely factored into the design of new functions and features. Due to the overhead of artists compared to engineers, the way things worked at Intercept Games were very art-focused. How the game looked was very important, how it worked, not so much. The resulting lack of baking multiplayer into the design was something that remained a problem right until they decided to fire all multiplayer developers a couple of months after the early access release. I have seen proof of working builds of the game that enabled players to inhabit the same game world and even launch rockets together, but most of the development team's energies were focused on the single-player experience. Multiplayer turned into a "we'll solve that problem later" thing. As I said in the beginning, I will do a separate video on that entire thing because I believe KSP2 multiplayer is interesting enough to stand on its own. For now, let's continue with the main storyline. Despite the old code hampering development and despite the COVID pandemic raging across the globe, the team grew and started to make progress. While Intercept Games managed to hire domain experts like Dr. Michael Dodd to help with physics and KSP modder Nortea to generally help with the game, it would take until mid-2021 before the developers that had worked on the original Kerbal Space Program were able to join the team. Remember when I said that there was no communication allowed between the two teams back in the Star Theory days? That continued through the Intercept Games era up until the developers were finally integrated into the KSP2 team. This meant that until now, the engineers working on the sequel could not learn from the experience of veteran KSP1 engineers.
I think that was a probably terrible mistake from a games development point of view. Like, I had these deep, long conversations with Felipe and Chad about how they had to solve all the problems of the orbital mechanics and the transformations between the domains, all these problems with the Unity engine that they had to work around. And that stuff needed to absolutely be in the hands of the new team, otherwise you make the same mistakes again and again.
From what I was told, when the KSP1 developers were finally on board, their reaction was, "You should have asked us a year ago." Yes, they should have. Even earlier. and they wanted to, but they were not allowed to. One of the reasons given to people at Intercept Games for the continued rigid wall between them and the KSP1 team was that Squad didn't want them to be distracted from finishing the final updates to the original game. However, there would have been multiple former KSP1 developers that could have been asked for input.
There were a lot of ex-KSP1 people who would have been very good to bring on board.
The creator of the game itself, Felipe Falang, also known as Harvester within the KSP community, was never contacted by anyone in the KSP2 project, despite having left Squad back in 2016 already.
It's always felt like quite weird to me that nobody ever reached out, which almost makes me think that there's been like some sort of pressure from somebody somewhere. I don't know, to prevent that from happening. It's the only way I can make sense of it in my head.
This makes the claim that not bringing in former KSP developers was due to any contract limitations harder to believe. More problems became apparent during the development period between 2020 and 2023. I already mentioned Nate Simpson's tendency to micromanage, something he also admitted doing in our interview in October 2023.
I may have been in the past a little bit intrusive or, kind of stick my nose in things.
But there were also producers changing priorities for developers, often forcing them to switch context between very different features. This is a general problem in software development. Engineers need time to immerse themselves into a problem before they can solve it. If they get yanked around all the time, they will not be able to do a good job on any of the things they should work on. This is something that was addressed within Intercept Games when the new feature team structure was introduced. There is more information about that in the aforementioned interview. From what I understand, this new setup was something that Paul Furier tried to establish before early access, but it was only implemented after he had left. More on his exit later. Remember when I said the original parameters for KSP2 were 2 years and $10 million? It was now the year 2022, 2 years after the original deadline had passed, and the game was still nowhere ready to be shipped. Costs had also exceeded the original budget. Take-Two had enough and gave the team a new hard deadline. They had to ship something by February 2023. It became clear that all key features would not make it into the game until that time, but there was still a chance that colonies might make it. However, in September 2022, the decision was made to go early access with a stripped-down sandbox-only version of Kerbal Space Program 2. As many who have analyzed the game's code have already assumed, it was never designed to be delivered in parts. Remember what I said about developers being yanked around? From what I was told, one of the engineers tried to make the colony builder work until early access for about 2 months and got very far, but was not yet finished. Product management pulled him out of that task despite him maybe just needing 2 or 3 more weeks until he would have been done. But some other item had to be ticked off a project list and colonies were shelved again. The budget problem led to another issue. Software engineers are in high demand, and at larger companies like Microsoft or Amazon, they could make $200,000 to $250,000 a year. In contrast, the compensation for engineers at Intercept Games was capped at $150,000 a year.
The maximum compensation that Intercept Game was willing to pay was $150K a year.
And that's hard. If you love games and that's what you want to do, sure, but you got to understand all the developers have better opportunities elsewhere.
Not only did this make things difficult when it came to recruiting, it also resulted in key people leaving for greener pastures. Remember Dr. Michael Dodd? He left a couple of months before early access. But the biggest blow came when graphics specialist Eric DeFelice left the project. He was responsible for shaders, which basically are small programs that render graphics data. They were all there, but they were seriously unoptimized. With nobody yet present in time for the release to pick up where he left, the game had to be shipped in a poor state that could have been prevented if Intercept Games had been able to pay industry-standard compensation. And I'm not necessarily talking games industry. Remember the timing. At the end of 2022, AI was already booming. ChatGPT had been released to the public in November 2022, and GPU specialists were in high demand, since graphics cards are used to calculate many of these large language models powering AI products. There was another, much more mundane issue. Despite being requisitioned multiple times, IT did not provide the necessary test systems for minimum and recommended specifications. Therefore, the team was not able to sufficiently test the game before the scheduled early access release. Nobody at Intercept Games really knew how badly the game would run on less powerful computers. And so it happened. Early access. Private Division and Take-Two put their marketing into full gear in the run-up to February 24th, 2023, the planned release date for KSP2 Early Access. The hype train was steaming along at full speed. You all remember the trailers and videos put out before that. There was also this big event they organized at the ESA Center in the Netherlands, where various YouTubers, including Scott Manley and Matt Lown, were invited to play a preview build ahead of Early Access. You already heard how Matt was disappointed in the wobbliness of his first rocket. Behind the scenes at Intercept and Private Division, tensions were high. Some decisions were made that did not sit well with everyone on the team. They knew that the game was not at the level they would have liked to deliver, and so there was large anxiety in regards to how the community would respond. The initial reaction from the content creators that got preview builds was mixed due to the many bugs still present in the game, but when the game was released to the public, a lot of the community that had been hyped up for years got angry due to what was delivered to them for the full price of $50. Back at Intercept Games, the Steam release numbers were put on a big screen in the conference room. The hope was for sales to break 100,000 copies on day one. But at the highest, the number capped out at about 80,000 from what I was told. This does not take into account how many people then refunded the game because of the lack of quality and content.
I was disappointed. It looked great until you tried doing something, and then it had too many problems. I haven't played it since then.
In hindsight, one of my sources told me that one of the biggest mistakes was not getting feedback from community stalwarts like Scott Manley or others early on. We wound up shipping the wrong product and not focusing on the right features, was what I was told. The secrecy and refusal to let KSP1 veterans near the project had indeed hurt the project down the line. Take-Two, wanting to control the marketing narrative, ended up in bad marketing, because now there was a flawed game out in the wild that garnered a lot of negative reviews.
The secrecy that's still ongoing, do you think that this has hurt the project and the relationship between KSP2 and the community?
I certainly feel that way.
A few weeks after the early access release, studio head Jeremy Abels and technical director Paul Furio were pulled into a meeting. Someone higher up had decided to get rid of the most expensive people in the studio, and that was the both of them. Furio was walked out the door on the same day. Abels stayed on for a few weeks more. Michael Cook, until then brand manager at Private Division, took over the job of studio manager. Not long after, the multiplayer developers were let go. Nobody would admit it openly, but the understanding was that KSP2 multiplayer might have been killed at that point instead of being a "we'll get to it later" thing. By that time, multiplayer was still janky and buggy, but it was working, at least in a limited capacity. The new focus became fixing bugs and working towards the science update, which would ship December 18, 2023. 10 months after the initial early access release. Previous internal estimations had put the For Science update at roughly 3 months, but that was before the backlash caused by the early access release resulted in a shift in priorities, and there was also the restructuring of the team into the cross-functional feature teams. Despite the long time until For Science came out, it was generally well received, and Colonies would have been the next on the roadmap. But then, very bad news came to light at the end of April 2024. Studio closure. I'm not going to dwell too much on this part of the story because I made multiple videos on it already. I'll link them below. Suffice to say, the fact that Intercept's offices in Seattle are closed, 70 people slated to be fired, and complete radio silence from the developers and publisher caused a lot of people to believe the game is done for.
A lot of people have been thinking like, okay, it's bad that the studio has been shut down, but at the end of the day, what were they doing for 7 years? And I think, the answers gleaned from these interviews with these, anonymous individuals has really shone a light on just how deep the problems went.
At time of recording, we still don't have any information on what is going to happen after the end of June when the job terminations will take effect. The last post on the official KSP Twitter account reads, "We're still hard at work on KSP2. We'll talk more when we can." Maybe there are going to be some minor upgrades, maybe colonies will come out but nothing more, or maybe Take-Two will refuse to even acknowledge that they have shut down the studio, just like they did previously when BioShock 2 developer 2K Marin was closed in 2013, with Take-Two to this day not losing a single word over it. So, I guess it is time for the conclusion. After watching this far, you now have a complete history of the development of Kerbal Space Program 2 as it was disclosed to me. You have heard about the many issues that have plagued this project from the beginning, from diverging visions to corporate takeovers to mundane things like test rigs not being delivered in time. It almost feels like it wasn't Kerbal Space Program, but Kerbal Project Management, just without the Kerbal aspect of learning from mistakes. Some key takeaways for me that anyone continuing working on KSP2 should take into account. The project was based on the wrong parameters from the start. You need to know what you want to build and what the goal is in order to make the right decisions. Technical decisions were made by people that had no business making them. If you want the best people for the job, you need to pay them accordingly. There were a lot of assumptions about gameplay and mechanics that the community might have wanted that were not verified until it was basically too late.
Honestly, all I wanted was all the best graphics mods integrated into the game and, maybe better aerodynamics and maybe like some way to actually write code against it and the ability to change out the planets. Simply, these were all things that could have been very easily added and they would have merited, sure, they could have sold it as a 2.0.
And finally, if you build something that relies on winning over an already existing fan base, you cannot keep everything so close to your chest and treat it as a secret, especially if you're going early access.
It's been pretty wild just how secretive they were. Okay, you can sort of forgive it if it wasn't going to be an early access game, but to maintain it after early access is like another level of strangeness. Like an early access game is the sort of game where you want to be as open and honest with your community as possible and make sure that communication is very clear. Because people are obviously putting a lot of money on the line for an incomplete game. They kind of want the assurances, they want to know what's being done, what the development team is like, but it's been very, very closed doors and walled garden. And even like me and you, we have somewhat special privileges in that we have a lot of direct lines to the developers. We've met the developers, we've seen things behind the scenes, and yet we basically know nothing more than what the community knows either.
One thing I haven't gone into too much detail is how much of this might have cost. The budget of $10 million might sound a lot in the beginning, but it won't last long if you expand your team.
$10 million can go very quickly. You get 10 people earning $100,000 to $150,000 a year. That means each person is going to be costing close to $200,000. So those 10 people in 1 year is going to use about $2 million.
If we just take the known Intercept Games employee numbers, they started out in 2020 with roughly 20 people. That would be $4 million. In 2022, the team had grown double the size despite the COVID pandemic going on, so we arrive at $8 million. Estimates say that there were 60 people overall working there in 2022, and between 2023 and 2024 we know it was around 70. If we use the calculation that Linux Guru Gamer provided by taking roughly $200,000 per year per employee, and this was also how one of my sources calculated it when speaking to me, we arrive at almost $40 million for the Intercept Games era alone in costs. Add to that the Star Theory years plus costs for buying the intellectual property from Squad, and we can easily calculate $60 million that have went into Kerbal Space Program 2 so far. And it appears that from a business standpoint, it wasn't really worth it at all. Of course, we don't know the exact sales numbers, but estimates range between $13 to $40 million in net revenue through sales on Steam. I know when things go bad, people like to look for somebody to blame. The easiest target is always the most public one. But is this warranted here?
I think the vitriol that some of the community has against Nate is a little bit unfounded. I think what's tricky is that when Nate is talking on camera, he's very good at it. Like, you get the sense that he's had extensive media training and he's able to sort of give long answers to questions without really saying anything. I don't know if that's kind of your perception of things. So when people like see that side of Nate, you know, in our videos and on camera, it's not, obviously I've met the guy, so I don't have this perspective, but I can see why some people might see it as a bit sort of artificial or fake or anything a little bit. As someone that's met Nate Simpson, I think that he really loves Kerbal Space Program. This was definitely a passion project for him. My first thought was, when the studio got shuttered, I was like, oh my god, Nate's probably crushed by this news. I don't have any bad feelings towards Nate Simpson. I might have some disagreements with some of the decisions he made, like wobbly rockets being a necessary part of Kerbal Space Program. But, you know, he's clearly a man of passion. He had a vision, and he obviously genuinely really wanted to elevate Kerbal Space Program 2. I respect Nate Simpson for wanting to actually the game to be something more than its predecessor rather than a glow-up.
I agree with Matt that Nate really wanted to deliver a great, fun game for the existing KSP community and all the future fans the franchise might gain. But often when you feel very strongly about something, your eyes are bigger than your stomach, and you end up biting off more than you can chew. Like when Nate promised comprehensive mod support from the start, already back in the Star Theory days.
When I spoke to Nate a little bit, he said they would definitely be in touch with me to help work out a modding API. And I got dead silence. I did try contacting them a couple of times. So yeah, we'll get to it. This is a few times over the past few years, and obviously we know what happened with that.
Initially, when Nate told Linux Guru Gamer that they wanted to have this modding API, I am sure he meant it. Just like I'm sure he wanted to have all these features like interstellar colonies and multiplayer in KSP2. But there were too many technical and business constraints in place that were maybe not visible enough from the start for everyone involved with the project to see that those goals probably cannot be reached in time and in budget. I asked Nate if he would like to comment on my findings, but unfortunately he didn't react in time before this video went live. Honestly, I think he would have loved to speak without the corporate muzzle he had to wear since 2019. So, where do we go from here?
Do you think there's still hope that KSP2 will one day be an actual finished product?
That would take two.
At the end of the day, Kerbal Space Program is a very weird, very nerdy, niche game, and so I wouldn't expect, the Take-Two corporate to really understand it.
I would still really like to see KSP2 built out to some level of completion. I think that Kerbals are an interesting IP, and things could actually happen with them because they were instantly a hit, because I saw cartoons and stuff with Jebediah Kerman, Thrill Master Extraordinaire, before the game was even at a pay version.
I would love to see some company or whatever come along and decide to do it the way it is, but they need between $60 and $80 million. And at this point, I would say anywhere from 4 to 7 years to start over, but I don't think anything's salvageable at this point. They have too much KSP1 code in there.
I probably would be surprised if they just did another Star Theory to Intercept move where they just shift everyone over to a new studio again, because yeah, I think Take-Two sound like they just don't want to put any more money into the project. We're speculating, aren't we? All we can do is speculate. I'm hoping for the best, but I'm expecting the worst.
Yeah, I hope that they get something done, because ultimately, I don't care about the colonies as much as I care about having a cleaner code base. Something that modders can attack. That's the way I see that they could reach some sort of salvation with this, is if they can get the modders on board.
That's what Nate promised. In his words, as close as I can remember, they were building a platform for modders to be able to build on. So yeah, I totally agree with Scott.
Before I sign off, let me address something about modding. While modders have elevated the original Kerbal Space Program far beyond what it was in the beginning, some mods even making it into the stock game, there are still limits to what modders can do. But I'll let the expert on this topic explain.
There's often in the community the sentiment of let the modders save the game. Do you think that some people in the community, that they have a rose-tinted glasses view of what modding can do and what modders are capable of?
Yes. The comment has been put out many times, well, let Linux Guru gamers save the game. I can't. What a lot of people don't understand, modding is not game development. There's a big difference between writing a mod for an existing game and developing a game from the ground up. There were, people say, look, a modder fixed this in 2 days. Well, yeah, but they don't know what it took to get it to the point where it was fixable in 2 days.
As I said in the beginning, this is not a video about laying blame at anyone. It is a video that wants to highlight real problems in KSP2's history, and my hope is that somebody over there at Private Division, or whoever now runs the game's development, will take note and starts to reflect on what went wrong and how it could be made better. There are already a lot of fences that need mending with the community. If you ever want KSP2 to be a success, you need to at least avoid breaking any more. This video took a lot of time and effort to make, so if you could spare a like and leave a comment, I would appreciate it a lot. As said in the beginning, please subscribe for more content coming soon, and if you want to further support my activities, you can join as a channel member on YouTube or head on over to Patreon. Both methods offer tiers that will give you early access, yes, I'm aware of the irony, to new videos if you select one of the higher tiers. And your name will show up here, like all of these wonderful people that already believe in what I do. Thank you so much for your support. I am with Matt that I hope for the best but expect the worst. Just in case, I have started a mountain biking channel to document one of my other favorite hobbies. If that's your jam, give old Dan Bruce over there a subscribe. He could need it, as well as more practice. Again! Yes, KSP2's development was a total mess. But so are many things in life and many other software projects. Believe me, I've seen a couple. The most important thing is learning from this and improving things for everyone involved. It's time for the people responsible to finally do so.
You only get anything good done if you try again and again and do it wrong a bunch of times.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel for more and follow me on my social thingies. The links are in the description. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.